Good morning, friends. We are so glad that you're here this morning. I want to begin this morning with a clear disclaimer that we will end this book group by 11:56 to make sure that you all can give thanks and be in prayer as we experience the inauguration this day. So we appreciate your willingness to be with us this morning. And we know that some of you will be watching even now. So we're hoping that we will move through this together. We do want to let you know that Reverend Gil Rendell will be with us just momentarily. He is just wrapping up a class and he's moving from that into our time together. So he should be getting here within about 5 minutes. And so we're going to begin with some conversation and Kevin will alert us as soon as Gil joins us. But as we gather this day, let's just give everyone 1 minute or so as folks come on. I think we've got everyone. We'll just wait 1 more second. And I'm going to take that noise off so you don't have to hear that. All right, 1 more minute. All right, let's pause this day for a moment of prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, come, renew us and restore us, both for the work of the church within the church, but even more so for the work of the church within our communities. Particularly this day, oh God, we pray for our new president and new vice president. We pray that they might do the work of building your kingdom in every space in which they enter. We thank you for this beloved community, this Zoom table where all are welcome, where all voices are heard. We pray for Gil Rendell this day as he comes to lead us. May the conversations that we have lead us to even more be the faithful leaders that you have called us to be in this, your beloved church. All this we pray in Jesus' name, amen. So as we wait for Gil this day, he asked if we would reflect momentarily on what we talked about last week. Specifically, he believes that in his book, the most important chapter is chapter 2. And you remember in there, he says that in a convergent culture, you lead with sameness, and in a divergent culture, you lead with difference. And I'm curious, and Gil is curious, and we will share this with him. How do you in your churches today lead with difference, and what does that look like? Or any other reflections you have from week 1 that you're thinking about, or that maybe last week something that Gil said spoke to you that you've been pondering this week or even enacting in your ministry? Anyone want to share any reflections? And then hopefully Gil will pop on in the middle of those. You can just unmute if you want to share.
I had a comment. I think what Gil was saying about seeing the change in culture not as a negative thing, but just as an is thing. Students of history tell us that times change, that different epochs come along. And we had been in a pendulum swing toward institutions. After World War II, institutions became and so for 30, 40 years, that was the swing. Now we're coming back towards individuals again. My sons are 24 and 27. And their biggest gripe and their generation's biggest gripe of the church is all institution, nothing personal. And some of the criticisms being the hypocrisy in that, and how people go to church but then don't live it with the literal neighbor next door. And so his suggestion and conversation about seeing them as both necessary and both having potential good and bad, I think might be helpful in an age particularly of culture wars, where those things can easily be put against each other, and maybe find some way to kind of pull those two together where we deal with institutional realities which are necessary, but also attend to individual spiritual growth and discipleship and evangelism and pull those two together, which is what John Wesley did. So, that's nothing new about, the high church and low church institution and individual evangelism. That's Methodist history.
Yeah, Lloyd, I think one thing, if I agree with a lot of what you're saying, especially the cultural shifts. And I guess one of the things that I would have maybe liked to have heard a little bit more, I think what I heard Gil was talking about is that there's a difference perhaps about being countercultural, which I think the church is called to be, and anti-cultural, which I think is what I heard Gil caution against. I also wondered, though, the repeated use of the phrase, I like the reference to the cycles and wondering, are we going to get back to this other time? But what I found interesting is the use of the word aberrant, which suggests to me that it's an unrealistic kind of thing. And I'm curious about how that fits into the cyclical part of history repeating itself and the shifts back and forth between individualism and more connected structure kind of thing. Yeah.
Anyone else? Reflections from last week?
I also think that the statement that, of course, we all know, the established institutional church cannot thrive on the good leadership it currently has. I think that goes beyond church leadership. I think about a lot of the leadership that we have in various components of our society. And good leadership, we need more. We need leaders that will help individuals move towards a common goal, and we haven't had that. So I think that resonated with me last week.
There's an interesting juxtaposition, right, Sue, between leadership, and yet we're in a culture that now values the voices of many. And so in one of our previous book groups, we talked about that. So it used to be, right, hierarchical leadership with a leader who speaks for all, versus the culture we're in now where multiple voices, right? So even when I get my news, how I get it is from many different voices. We've learned that even through how social media outlets engage many different voices. So there is this interesting both and, right? Leadership and how do we lift up the voices of many? I saw Judy.
Early on in the book, the first big thing that impacted me was this. It's about the water that we're in, not our swimming. And I really, really, really have been considering that. It's about the water that we are in. That's our total environment. That's all the cultures around us, not our swimming.
Anyone else?
I was interested in the holy conversation. I kept looking at those questions. Who are we now? And what does God call us to do now? And who is our neighbor? I found that kind of even dovetailed into the book we read last month about the post-quarantine church. And the questions are, they really help any group focus back down into what's important.
So what stayed with me, if you could hear me, I hope you can. What stayed with me in the book on page 27 was this quote from Haiphaz, where he says, instead of looking for saviors, we should be calling for leadership that will challenge us to face problems for which there are no simple, painless solutions. Problems that require us to learn new ways. I thought that was really appropriate, especially at this time where, sometimes there are rewards in the church, and looking for easy rewards, not the rewards that challenge us or challenge the pastor of the church in a difficult way that will help the church grow. I thought that was really, really one of the important things that I got out of this chapter.
What was your reflection in this chapter on divergence? Gil also talks about this idea of super zips, that a lot of folks live within a homogenous community, and even particularly leadership. And I'm thinking about this with today with the inauguration. Sometimes we don't know folks from other zip codes, and we haven't related. And he says, because the new elite and the new lower class do not live together, they are unaware of one another's context for living. And so folks make decisions that influence other people's lives that they do not understand the people over whom they hold sway. Did that speak to you? What does it look like in your churches as you think about Gil's reflection on homogenous communities? Any reflections on that? I feel like, go ahead,
Yeah,
please.
just the distrust of elites, of institutions, but elites. Fareed Zakaria, in his book, 10 Lessons from a Post-Pandemic World, I think talks about some of what Gil's getting at. To be able to trust elites have to be able to have empathy or identify with those who are maybe more on the margins or not in their same zip code. So that's how I would respond to the question you're asking there, Dawn. The distrust of elites, but they're experts in the field, and we've somewhat dismissed their knowledge because maybe they don't empathize or identify with those that aren't in their particular zip code. So how do, Zacharias talks about the need for elites, those who are knowledgeable, but they need to be those who are, again, empathetic to the whole population, somehow connect to the whole population. I don't know if that's what Gil's trying to get at also.
Hopefully Gil's going to join us momentarily, but we'll keep going. Towards the end of that beginning section that we're looking at, Gil begins to share that, what we're facing as a church is that increasingly individuals are not seeking or not exclusively seeking to pursue these values through organized religion. And particularly, right, not through already established congregations. So people are seeking community in other ways. I tell the story that I always would attack sports on Sundays until my daughter started playing competitive travel softball. And I watched how these people created a community with one another. I watched how when someone was sick in that community, this travel team were the ones who showed up at the doorstep with the meals. I watched as these people gave energy and time. Here comes Gil, thanks be to God. But I watched as people received the experience of community in these other ways. And so I realized the church often had missed the mark. Gil, we welcome you and we are glad you're here. We will stop our conversation now and let you begin.
Oh, no, don't stop your conversation. I just need to say I'm sorry I'm late. I got caught in traffic. And if you buy that one, well, okay, here we go. No, friends, thanks. I'm sure a word was said that I had some responsibility. There's a gathering down in the Southeast jurisdiction with the bishops and the cabinets, and Today and tomorrow, I am part of that, and we had a little bit of an overlap. And so, thanks very much, Dawn and Kevin, for kind of keeping this going. Let me jump right in because of the time, if you don't mind. Last week, when we were talking about Quietly Courageous, we were focused on the fact that we're living in a changed world, kind of a changed American culture. We moved from the convergent to the divergent. We talked about that changed social contract from giving and getting to this moral pole star. We have shifted from a relational world to an individual world. And institutions and the congregation as an institution has been part of the collateral damage in that. All of our institutions have suffered, as we began to talk about last time, and congregations have as well, particularly mainline Protestant congregations, because we have been one of the strongest voices for the common good in our culture over a period of time. And so when the common good fell out of favor, so did institutions who reminded people of their responsibility to the common good. And so we've been all part of that story. Let's see if we can't move ahead. Oh, and the one thing I wanted to say before we jump into the new is that we were talking last time that this is not about us simply trying to solve it as if it's a problem, as if there's an answer to this. And that if anything, working harder and working faster is not going to make a difference. Alpesh Bhatt, who is one of the kind of consultant who really has followed this kind of a change in organizations across the wide span of all different kinds of organizations, says that leaders have been working as hard as ever only to find themselves back where they started. And that what we need is not new things to do, but we need a new mindset. We need a new way to understand this. We need kind of a new perspective that allows what we've got going. Okay, Kevin, it just came up that I am disabled to do my screen sharing. Can you shift hosting over toward me so I can do that?
Dawn, can you please make Gil a co-host?
Yes, you should have it now, Lloyd. Gil.
Okay. No, I'm still disabled. A lot of people have thought that for a long time, but nope, still there.
I think you just have to allow screen sharing for him.
Kevin, I'm trying, but it's not allowing me to get onto Gil to do that.
Security.
Lloyd, I see that Lloyd Spear is a co-host. Can he get him on?
Oh, Lloyd, why don't you just finish up then?
Kevin, are you, it's on your Zoom.
Okay.
Can you?
Okay. Tell you what, friends, let's.
That's it.
Lloyd, you should be able to make Gil the co-host because you're the host.
Okay.
I can't do it as co-host.
Okay, that's fine. From where?
If you go to the participant list and over on the right-hand side, it'll have a more button. If you hover on his name.
Yep. Okay. Find it. It's not alphabetical.
On the top, it has find a participant. You can type his name.
And the more.
Yeah, under more, it should have make co-host.
There you go.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And my apologies for not having this worked out ahead of time. I really want to walk us through this whole issue about a change in mindset. If there is anything about the book Quietly Courageous, It is in trying to help us as leaders to think about not only that we need to look at things in a different way, but what are some of the places that we could begin to work to see things in a different way? And what is it that we're going to have to address? And so you may have noticed that, the beginning part of the book is the introduction and this chapter 2, which I see as the most important chapter of trying to give some shape to this changing culture that we are going through. But then from there, we move into the assumptions and the temptations. And so these assumptions and temptations are part of what we need to change about ourselves in order to have a mindset that allows us to lead religious institutions in a different way. Now, do not miss the point that when we're talking about this, we are not talking about leaders trying to change other people, as much as that is the favorite work of spouses and leaders. We always love to change somebody else. The reality is that what we're talking about here is that if we are going to have a new mindset, we have to change ourselves. And in a part of that, what we have to do is change some of our assumptions. Now let's talk about assumptions themselves for a moment. Assumptions live in a particular place within us. One of the prevalent ways to describe the self is in 3 different forms. And you can think about them as layers of the self. At the top is the conscious self. This is the part of us that we know the best. And it's also the part that most other people can understand as well, because they see it. That which is conscious to us is already a part of our awareness, and we operate out of it. And we can easily change it if we want. If you shift down to the lowest level, you have the unconscious self. And this is the part of ourselves that is not only hidden from other people, it's also hidden from ourselves. We do not have easy access to it. Part of the whole discipline of psychology has been to help us, particularly in terms of psychiatry, to help us gain access to that unconscious self, which takes a tremendous amount of work. And because it's hidden from us, it often can control our behavior without even our awareness. And so we are people who have a conscious self and an unconscious self. But in between is this layer, which is the tacit world. That which we are not aware of, but if we chose to, we could easily pull it forward. And the reason we're not aware of it is because we don't need to be aware of it all the time. They are decisions that we've already made in our lives, or practices that we've already figured out that serve us and serve us well and allow us to continue without having to think about it. Think about your congregation. And, if it is a congregation that has developed, let's say, a pattern of worship over a year's time, they know January 30th what they're going to do for Christmas Eve worship services on December 24th at the tail end of the same year, because it's part of their tacit practice. They've already decided they're going to have how many services at what different times and what the nature of that service is going to be. They've already established how they're going to do things, and it frees them up from having to sit down every year and say, what am I going to do for Christmas Eve? However, if there was some reason why they had to rethink it, they could easily pull it up and say to themselves, well, this is what we've done in the past. Should we continue? That is the level that assumptions live on in our lives. We assume we can go about things in a particular way, and we don't question them, and they are hidden. This is one of the reasons why people don't take coffee into your sanctuary, because they've already assumed that that's not really appropriate behavior. But if you wanted to pull it up and question it, whether or not that's okay to do, it's easy to do that. You can pull it up. It just needs some awareness. And so When you're reading the book of, Quietly Courageous, or while we're talking about, some of these assumptions with the time that we have, there's a couple of things that I think that we can do. Well, let me say first that, in the book, there are 4 different assumptions that I point to. One is, how does change in fact happen? And if there is anything that is the largest shift in my world, in my thinking, in terms of how I understand the world, this is the one. That I grew up in a world that changed in a very linear way, and that now changes in a dramatically different way. And we'll get into that a little bit more, even though we started that conversation last week. But also our assumptions about what resources are and how we use them. And our assumption about organizations and how they work, and democracy and how we practice it. And our assumptions about how leadership, including our own leadership, is formed. There are some very, very basic things that we're going to have to rethink in order to live ourselves into this changed world that we're now in. So what I'm trying to say is that when we pull assumptions up, the way that we can work on that the best, and the way that I encourage you to do this work when you're reading the book or we're having these conversations, is first to begin to question yourself, not other people, but simply question yourself. Do I hold this assumption? Do I see it in myself? And one of the best ways that you can get at that is not whether or not you think it, but whether you behave it. What examples can I pull up about my own behavior that demonstrate that this assumption is alive in my leadership? Can I point to places where I behave as if I hold that assumption? And if we're taking these kind of tacit assumptions and raising them for examination, if we find we do hold the assumption, then the way to move ahead is to say, what is a different or what is a better assumption? And it isn't just whether I think differently, but whether or not I can move my behaviors to frame that changed assumption. Can I lead in a different way? Not just in my mind, but also with my behaviors as well. And so for me, when we get into this part of Quietly Courageous, where we have to kind of rethink and rebehave how we operate, it is changing a mindset that allows us to serve our religious institutions, our conference, and our congregations in a remarkably different way. So let's jump into it a little bit here and see where we go. We started this conversation last week about how change happens. That in fact, I was kind of trained in a linear model of change. Continuously, people, for the most part, are still trained in this model, a problem-solving model. I think we talked about this last week, I'm not sure. But the model of change here is that what you do is you identify problems, and then you identify the options or solutions to that problem. You make a decision upon what you can do, and then you act on it. Now, I've had a couple of other conversations with groups between last week and this week, and so I'm not sure whether I use this example. If I did, then just nod your head and say, well, that's still a good example, Gil. But in my first student appointment in Massachusetts, which I shared with Barry Wood, who is my sister's husband's brother and uncle to Laura Mazel, who's on this Zoom, which is information you all don't need to know, but I wanted to at least tell her I remembered. In that congregation, which was in Massachusetts, if it was February and the boiler broke down on Tuesday, that would be known as a problem. It has a clear problem that has a clear solution. And I flip right into my linear model of change because that's how it's going to work. And so I identify the problem, the boiler is broken. I identified my options by calling the lay leader and said, who's responsible for the boiler and who works on the boiler and who should I call? And then getting all those decisions in line, I act and I call, the repairman. He comes in, fixes the boiler so that from Tuesday when it was broken to Sunday, we now have heat. And we were trained that that's how the world works. That if you can identify the problem and go through these steps, you will get to the point where it absolutely, corrects what went wrong. And the reason we've been trained that way is because it really does work. It works when you have a problem. It is the application of known solutions to known problems. And this is what we talked about last week. But the other thing I want to point out is that in a time of great change like we are in right now, if the only thing we have is a linear model of change, then working that model all the time cannot do anything more than take us back to a time that we were in before we had the problem. In other words, a linear model inappropriately used today doesn't move us ahead, it moves us back. If the boiler was broken on Tuesday and I do my work well and the repairman comes in and does his or her work well, then all of our work together is not going to move us ahead. It's going to take us back to the previous Monday prior to the time when the boiler broke down. Linear models still work today. Change can still happen like that today if in fact we have a problem. But part of what we talked about last week is that most of what we are now looking at is not a problem, it's a condition. Things have changed so rapidly in this liquid culture. They have changed so dramatically that we can no longer go back and we have to move ahead. But moving ahead in unknown territory is not a linear kind of a process. And so we have to change our mindset. No longer does the leader sort and search about for an answer to come back and say, I know what we should do, come follow me. Now the leader has to stand with others in the question and help them to figure out how to be and how to move ahead. And in one of the better nonlinear models that I am aware of, the way that leadership is talked about here is that you don't run around trying to convince everybody what their problem is. What you do is you help them to understand their pain and their possibility. John Shear, who is the author of this particular model, trying to bring it together so people can understand it, talks about the fact that the very first thing a leader has to do is help people get in touch with their pain and the possibility. The way that that's been expressed by others who have done work in this area is to say that the first task of a leader is to give an honest description of the current reality. Now, in institutional churches today, for the most part, that's a very painful, honest appraisal. To be able to say and to stand with people and to help them to see and to say together, as an institution, we are less than we used to be. As a congregation, we may well have fewer members than we did in the past. That we, in fact, are struggling with our budget. That, in fact, we don't see our faith replicated or mirrored in our culture in ways that we used to. This is our current reality. And to help people understand that this is not a problem that is going to be solved. This is, in fact, part of the collateral damage of a changed culture. It is not within our control. But to be able to say to them at the same time, if this is our current reality, there are some possibilities that make us significantly important as a Christian community. That as much as we are collateral culture to this value shift that we were talking, that you and I were talking about last week, We are still in a culture in which people are searching for community even more so today than they used to in the past because they feel its absence. And the faith that we hold is a faith that offers community, and it offers a means of grace, a means in which people can come together over their differences. We know this if we go back into our own history and into our own convictions and into our own theology and into our own relationship with Christ. Yes, we have suffered in this culture as an institution, but we still hold a treasure, even if it's in an earthen vessel. Now, hear what I just said. The possibility I named is not the solution to the pain. It's simply the acknowledgement that, yes, things are difficult at the moment, but we still hold a treasure that other people value and that we see as well. And in nonlinear change, the leader has to learn how to give up the search for answers when there are none, and instead learn how to stand with the people to bring some kind of understanding to the pain and the possibility that they now find themselves in, to give it meaning and to give it purpose. One of the things that John Shear said is that if in fact we want to give birth to change, then the two parents necessary are pain and possibility. Romans 8 talks about a pregnant creation. Friends, our culture has never been so pregnant as it is in the moment. It is waiting for something to be birthed for the people who can stand in the anxiety of the moment and bring some purpose to it and some meaning to it, and stop trying to go back to where they were before they had what they think is a problem. And so then the second thing the leader has to do is to help people get out of the box. To stop thinking about everything in the same way. And the pandemic is helping us there. We used to think that the only way you could worship would be on Sunday morning in a particular building with an organ and a choir, and Zoom kind of talked us out of that real quick. Well, what would it be like if in this kind of a setting, leaders could help people get out of the box and to stop thinking about having to do it the same way? Now, we're going to run into this problem a little bit when the pandemic finally settles down, and people are going to be able to go back and into social gatherings and want to go back into their congregation. And the largest threat we will have is that they will forget what they have learned in a time when they had to live outside the box. So one of the roles of leadership at that point will be to remind people what they've already learned. That yes, if we are collateral damage to a culture, and yes, if we still have a treasure in earthen vessels, and yes, if we've learned how to live in virtual digital space, isn't there a different way for us to be a community of faithful? Well, the thing about nonlinear change is that when leaders do their best work, it doesn't lead to a solution, it leads to chaos. It leads to not knowing. And this is one of the most important and advantageous positions we could ever be in. I think it was Yuval Harari in his book on species talks about map makers back in the 15th and 16th century, where maps began to take on empty spaces. Up to that point, people who were drawing maps of the world that they knew would fill in the maps, empty spaces on the maps, with whatever they could imagine, whether they were sea monsters coming out to show you what was in that space, or whether they were mountain ranges that they had just imagined. They couldn't live with a map that had empty spaces until the scientific discovery began to impress upon people how important it was to recognize what you do not know. And suddenly map makers, cartographers began to draw maps that had empty spaces to indicate that there is geography there that we do not know. the Latin ignoramus, we do not know. That the first step of learning the new steps is by acknowledging what we do not know. In nonlinear change, we need leaders who are able to stand with people in their pain and possibility, to give it purpose and meaning, to help them to stop thinking in old ways, and to know how to stand with people and say, when it comes to moving ahead, we do not know. So let's take a first step. In the work that I've been doing with bishops across the connection, I have been repeatedly saying to them that their task is tremendous, because they have to lead with great confidence without knowing where they're going. That takes a lot of courage. And so, you have to be able to follow people to where they're going to go, to the natural reordering that is going to take place, and to manage your own anxiety. One of the stories that I would tell annual conferences when I was working with them on restructuring, then sometimes we would have hundreds of people in the room, all wanting to know the answer about, okay, how's this going to work and what's going to happen next? And I would use this little story about a mother who lived on a farm, who on a pitch black night, when there was no moon, said to her young son, go on out and make sure that the barn door is locked. And so the little boy left the kitchen, walked out into the dark, and within 15 seconds, he came back in. And the mother said, well, what's the problem? And he said, well, it's too dark. I can't see the barn. So she handed him a flashlight and said, okay, go check the barn door, make sure it's locked. He walks out and he comes back in 20 seconds. And she says, what's wrong now? And he said, well, the flashlight's not strong enough. I still can't see the barn. And she responded by saying, you don't need to see the barn. Just walk to the end of the light. Because the reality is when you walk to the end of the light, it already shows you the next steps of the path that you can take. All you need to know is that the barn is in a particular direction, a general direction one way, and not in the opposite direction. That's enough to get started when you are standing in chaos looking for a purpose. Take your best step. And then ask, what have you learned from that? And how are you going to move ahead? Okay, I hope in the description you can hear the difference between the linear model of change, and if that's the only way we assume things move ahead, then you as a leader have to figure out all the answers. And then you have to be able to come back and say, follow me, I'll show you what you should do. And friends, if we have been in this cultural moment in which congregations have been struggling for 50 years, if someone had come up with the answers, don't you think they would have mentioned it by now? No, we need to change our mindset and understand that we are in a time of nonlinear change, and that our role as leaders, clergy and lay, is significantly different. Stop looking for an expert. The day of the expert is over. The day of learning together what the next steps are is on us. I hope you can see how we have to wrestle with ourselves and our assumptions before we jump into that. Let me jump out of screen share here for a moment. Just say, is there any particular question you want to go at before I jump back into something else?
Yes, Gil, it's Kevin. We're aiming to end at about 11:55 so people can get to the inauguration. So I just wanted to give you we have about 11 minutes left.
You bet. Okay, any particular question, or should I just double down here, folks? All right, I'm going to double down. Let's go back to the screen share. And all I wanted to do was to pick up one other example, and that is this assumption about resources. This is one of the places where, when I travel across the church, not just the Methodist Church, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, wherever I go, we are struggling with, the resources that we are now trying to work with. And a lot of our leaders are kind of saying to themselves that, they'd like to try some things or they'd like to move in new directions. They simply don't have what is needed to make that happen. They don't have enough people. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough time. You can go anywhere you want with this. And in fact, in order for us to move ahead under these conditions, we have to, again, challenge our own assumptions and our assumptions of what resources are and our assumptions of how many we have. And I want to frame this part, from a place that was a really significant help for me and for my wife, Lynn, in a little book called The Soul of Money by Lynn Twist, who someone just kind of tossed the book at me. I was working with a church and they were using this book on a governing board retreat, and they had an extra copy and they said, well, Rendell, you might as well read it. We got one left over. So he tossed it to me and I read it and I was so taken with it. I took it back to my wife and said, you got to read this. She was so taken with it. We immediately bought copies for our two sons and their wives. Lynn Twist is not Christian. As a matter of fact, I believe that in her own origin is Jewish, but she works with non-religious organizations, some of amazing poverty and some organizations of unbelievable wealth. And she has learned this world between poverty and wealth. And one of the things that she has pointed out is that, we who live in North America are in one of the most resource-rich environments you could live with, and yet we still only talk in terms of scarcity. We define everything that we experience by what we don't have. And our conversations move quickly into how we don't have enough money for everything we want to do. We don't have the kind of home that would allow us to do some things that we would like to do. We don't have enough time to get everything done. We don't get enough sleep. We're always tired. We define everything by the scarcity that we find in our life, despite the fact that we are surrounded by resources. And she said that what we do in our culture is that when we encounter scarcity, our preference is to move to try to find abundance. How will we replace scarcity with abundance? And so we think of abundance as if it's more. Abundance we define as more money, more time, more sleep, more whatever it is that's bothering us. But the problem with that, as she points out, is that every time we move to abundance in a consumer society, abundance, if it's measured by more, is always available to be defined as even more yet. You have a 54-inch TV, you can always get a 70-inch TV. You can always get a 90-inch TV. No matter what you look at in a culture of abundance, if you approach it from a consumer's point of view, more can always be defined as even more beyond that. And so abundance starts to find its own scarcity. She said, what if we redefined what we experience neither as scarcity or abundance, but as sufficiency? What if we already have enough? I've been working with bishops on this for a long time to get around to the point in terms of it isn't whether or not you've got enough congregations or leaders or resources to do what you have always done in the past. The question is, do you have enough resources to do what is required of you in the moment? That's where the crunch is. As leaders of congregations, it isn't whether or not we have enough members, people, buildings, dollars to do what we used to do when we remember ourselves in an earlier time. The question is whether or not we have enough to do what we are now being called to do, given the changed world that we are living in. Quite frankly, one of the problems I've been talking about with a number of our leaders is, what if we have too many resources? What if an annual conference has too many congregations? So that there's a number of congregations that are in such weakened state that they can no longer do anything except pull down the efforts of our denomination to represent Christ in a Wesleyan way in our neighborhoods and in our regions. What about our churches that have too many resources? They have too much building. They can't possibly use all that building, even though they have a legal and a financial responsibility to care for that building. I mean, you can point to a whole lot of places where we actually have too much of the resources that we no longer use or need. And in order to get at that, we have to test our assumptions again. How do we think about resources? And how do we define resources? On the slide you're looking at here, the difference between outcomes and resources, you'll see two arrows. The top arrow is a simple model that comes from Edmunds Deming, who was an organizational consultant, who actually is credited with turning around Japanese manufacturing after the Second World War. And he did it using this very simple model, that in order to understand what you're doing as an organization, you need to be very clear about three things. What is your input? What is it that goes into your system? And these are nouns, these are resources. This is time, this is money, this is buildings, this is, if you're a manufacturing or organization, this is the equipment that you need. This is the insurance that you're going to have to, all those things that you have to provide in order for you to be in function. This is your input, that's what goes in. And then you have to understand your throughput. What do you actually do with all these resources? These are your verbs and your activities. This is how you break your work down. This is how you think about the component parts of everything that you have to do in order to get to your output. What is it that you're trying to make different? Well, if you're an automobile manufacturer, the input has a lot to do with all of those materials and those parts and those pieces and the personnel, the people you have to hire and the equipment you have to put in place. And then you're going to have an assembly process, which is your throughput, that will get you to an automobile as the output. But what Deming pointed out is that you need to build your systems backwards. You have to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish as the output before you go back and understand what resources you need. Right now, friends, most of the places I go in religious institutions are not thinking it through with the top arrow. They're working on the bottom arrow. And they think that their output is caring for their buildings and getting their budgets up and getting enough members. And they focus all their time on those things as if that's what we are called to do. And in fact, we have put our resources in the place of our output where all of our worry and anxiety is. We need to rethink that. This is one of the assumptions we have to push really, really hard. That in fact, we need to get much clearer in this changed culture and in our own neighborhoods. What is it that God actually calls us to make different here now? Before we go back and then ask, what are the resources that we will need in order to do that? We have so long put ourselves in service to our resources that this is one of the deepest assumptions that we have to address. Okay, so we are now coming up to that, 11:55 time that Kevin was talking about. I'm sorry that I had to be detained getting into this. Next week, I'm hoping to move ahead to talk not just about assumptions, but about temptations, because they in fact work differently in us. And it's all part of us trying to understand what is the task and the role that God has called us to now in this changed environment that we're going to have to rethink because it's so dramatically different than it was in the past. So friends, thanks for being here and for taking the time to be a learning community and learn together.
Thank you. Good afternoon, friends. God bless you.
Thank you.
Over.
12 o'clock.
I think they stop at 10 up so that they can watch the